Today's eventcast is being held as part of the Manhattan Institute's New York City Reborn project, and is entitled America, Cities vs. Hills. Today's panel will feature Kristen Soltis Anderson, Jonathan Roden, and will be moderated by the Manhattan Institute's Director of State and Local Policy, Michael Hendricks.
Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's discussion on America's urban-rural divide. I'm Michael Hendricks, Director of State and Local Policy. We've heard America described as a city on a hill before, but our elections look more like the city and its hills, with a stark and growing divide between urban and rural America, blue cities and red states. And America's urban-rural partisan divide seemed to just deepen with this year's election, with cities and many suburbs becoming bluer as rural areas grew redder. In this discussion, we'll dive into the 2020 election and its insights, and into an America that's fast becoming the city and its hills. Throughout our program, please enter your questions on any of the platforms you're watching us on, and I'll wrap them into our discussion. And now to welcome our panelists, we're thrilled to be joined today by Kristen Soltis Anderson, the co-founder and partner at Echelon Insights. She's the author of The Selfie Vote, a contributor and host at Fox News, a columnist at Washington Examiner, and I still haven't even captured all of her accomplishments. And we're also joined by Jonathan Roden, professor of political science at Stanford University, as well as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. He's the recent author of Why Cities Lose: The Deep Roots of the Urban-Rural Political Divide, which, for a good reason, reviewers have been calling masterful, astute, and a towering achievement. It's good to be with you both.
Of course. Thanks for having us, Michael.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Now, Kristen, let's start with you. What happened in 2020? What were the differences between how cities, suburbs, and the country voted?
Well, it's not unusual for cities to lean very Democratic in their vote and for more rural areas to lean more Republican. It's a favorite pastime of Republicans to show off that map of the United States, which sort of shows county by county how everyone voted. And of course, the United States looks like this big sea of red, dotted by a handful of blue jewels here and there, and those are the cities. The story is a little more complex this time around, in part because essentially Democrats had maxed out how good they were going to do in cities, or how well they were going to do in cities. There was not much more for them to grow. But the suburbs is really where there had been so much political battle being fought, especially during the 2018 midterms, where Democrats had made real inroads. And so one of my favorite maps that I think describes what happened in this election is a map that was put together by the folks at the New York Times Upshot, where they took Georgia and they did two maps. One was precinct by precinct, how red or blue were folks voting. And of course, Atlanta is a big blue blob. All of the cities, Savannah, Macon, what have you, anywhere where there's density, you wind up seeing Democrats doing better. But then they have a second map that I think really tells the story of what happened this time around and what made 2020 unique. And it was the swing. So how much did a precinct change and become redder or bluer versus where it was 4 years ago at the presidential level? And in this case, what you see is it winds up going from being a blue blob around Atlanta to being like a blue donut, where the center of downtown is actually a little bit pink, that actually Donald Trump did a couple of points better in some cases in the very urban core, where it was the suburbs that wound up swinging heavily to Democrats, and then the more rural areas that are also sort of pink to light pink and light red, swinging even more Republican than they had 4 years ago. So for me, what's interesting is less that we have this huge rural-urban divide, but rather that in some ways, both the inner cities and the rural areas both swung just a teeny tiny bit toward Republicans compared to where they were 4 years earlier, while it was the suburbs that swung very blue.
That's fascinating. Jonathan, you've been studying this urban-rural divide. Did any of the results from 2020, like what Kristen just mentioned, surprise you?
Well, I wouldn't say surprised. It is the case. In the book, I have some scatter plots between population density and Democratic voting, and we look at those scatter plots, and we see the slope increasing, and we see the standard deviation decreasing, and it becomes more powerful in every election. And I wasn't surprised to see that happened again. Now that's with county level maps. When we get down to the precincts, things get a little bit more interesting. And I was also really fascinated by the same map, which I've also reproduced in some other states. And we see this kind of donut of in pivotal areas in the suburbs. Usually if you make a partisan map, you see kind of a donut of more competitive places around the big cities. And this time we see this big movement toward the Democrats in those pivotal places. But one of the things that did surprise me a little bit, that I'm still kind of trying to come to grips with, and I think we'll probably want to talk about a bit more in this discussion, is I'd like to see some more maps, precinct level maps, of the difference between the Democratic vote share in the presidential election and in the down ballot races, because in Georgia, in the other every other statewide race, including some low profile administrative executive positions, we see a gap between what happened in the presidential election and what happened in the down ballot races, and of course the same is true in House races. So split ticket voting is alive and well, but it's a different variety of split ticket voting than what we've seen in the past. So historically, when we look at districts that split their ballot between Democrats and Republicans, it's the other way around. It's a Republican presidential candidate and a Democratic candidate in a House race. And this time we're seeing something new. We're seeing the opposite type of split ticket voting. And so that's one of the things that I was fascinated by, and I'd like to do some more to understand.
Well, and Kristen, I'm wondering if you have any reactions to that, but also if you found anything interesting about maybe the Republican overperformance in places like Miami-Dade or urban areas or urbanizing areas that still remained red, and what we could possibly learn from them.
Well, a big part of Florida staying a red state, even in a year when many other swing states were flipped blue, was the strength of the Republican message with Hispanic voters, and in particular kind of working class Hispanic voters. So in Miami-Dade, you do see, especially the precincts where you have large numbers of Cuban Americans, big swings toward Donald Trump. And that's a testament to not just Trump, but the Florida Republican Party that has spent many, many years making investments in connecting with these communities and talking to them about conservative solutions to the problems that they find most pressing. But you also had interesting swings in, I wrote a column about this, my hometown area of Orlando, Florida. I grew up right on the border between Orange and Osceola counties. And Osceola County is much more rural than Orange County is. Orange County has downtown Orlando. It has, the big theme parks, where Osceola County, much more rural. If you came to visit me and you wanted to go to Disney, you'd go to Orange County. If you wanted to take an airboat ride, we go to Osceola County. But Osceola County is also majority Hispanic, and is in fact the county in the US that's seen the largest growth in its Hispanic population since the year 2000. It's largely Dominican and Puerto Rican. So it's not the same dynamic as kind of this message about socialism that was so compelling to many Hispanic voters in Miami-Dade. Instead, it's a message about the economy. It's a message about crime and safety. Those are the sorts of things that I'm seeing data particularly resonant, and that have in some ways sort of fused some of these rural areas, a county like Osceola that is both rural but also majority Hispanic. We saw this happen again along the border in Texas. A lot of places where Republicans saw their greatest increases were places that were quite diverse and had voters that simply, it seemed, feel like they were not hearing from the Democrats a message that resonated with them.
And I do want to dig into that intersection between density and diversity too, especially toward the latter part of our conversation and where we go from here. But Jonathan, I want to turn to you to get a little bit more of the history. You've written before on the deep roots of this urban-rural divide. For myself, I remember being surprised when the 2000 electoral map showed up, and I began, for the first time that I could recall, to see this deep division between blue cities and red rural areas. But as you've written, there's a long history to this. Give us a little sense of that history of the urban-rural divide.
Yeah, I think my work on this probably also started by seeing some of those maps and getting curious and trying to understand where it all came from. And one of my first reactions wasn't just to go back historically, but was to also look abroad and see that the maps look very similar in lots of other countries. Labor parties and social democratic parties are concentrated in urban areas in a similar way, perhaps not quite to the same extent as the United States, but one of my favorite maps to present is one in which I make a precinct level map of the northern U.S. and southern Ontario, but don't show any indications of where the border is, and it looks exactly the same. The concentration of left voters in urban areas in Canada is similar to the U.S. So that was one observation. Then the question is, where did this all come from? And the answer was very clearly to me was the Industrial Revolution. It was when factories started to employ lots of newly arrived laborers in urban centers, and lots of working class housing was built. And some parties started to mobilize those people and make connections to the labor movement. That's when these parties became urban parties. And then that's kind of the first part of the book. And there was a time when I was thinking of all of this as really a story about labor mobilization. But that's a story that only really gets us until the U.S., till around maybe the Reagan administration. We see even before they even started in the 30s, we see deindustrialization very quickly of American cities, and a movement of industrial activity to exurban areas and to the south, and the decline of labor unions. But yet this density, democratic correlation just grows stronger. And so what I tried to do then was understand, well, what happened really since, the density divide really starts to pick up in the 80s, and it just gets stronger since then. So I think we eventually have to move beyond economic issues and the labor movement and so forth, and start to understand some ways in which the party's platforms have changed, and the way the parties kind of respond to the issues that people in their geographic base care about. And so the Democrats adopt a pro-civil rights agenda that is really pushed by urban African Americans in places like Detroit and Cleveland who moved to those cities in the Great Migration. The Democrats become a party of civil rights, and that really changes the geography of their support. The social issues, abortion and so forth, which preferences on those issues are highly correlated with population density. The Republican Party kind of responds to its more rural religious constituency and starts to adopt its in the 80s adopts its positions against abortion rights, and so these things start to push this density divide even further. And with every new issue that's come along, free trade, globalization, and the knowledge economy, all of these things correlate with density, and it just pushes this divide even further.
And just to press on that a little bit more, the correlation between density and Democratic vote share, it grows by region, right? But it grows in patches. So just out of curiosity, when was the last region where we saw cities finally tick over to voting Democratic? And just what was that arc of change throughout America's map?
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating things about it is that the thing that we're talking about that we find so interesting. I mean, it's been there since the 20s and 30s in Massachusetts and New York, but then it starts to emerge in places like Pennsylvania, and it kind of slowly started to spread in the industrial Northeast. But this kind of density divide was not there at all in the Mountain West, and in the South it was the opposite. The rural areas were more likely to vote for Democrats. And so it was the realignment of the South was kind of the last thing to happen, but it also emerged slowly in the Mountain West. But really it was the South that was kind of the laggard. And if you just kind of look at the correlation between density and voting, and you plot it over time, you see that all of the states converge, where for a while it was this Northeast thing and the upper Midwest thing. And then quickly the South catches up. And so now Democrats are concentrated in Atlanta and big urban centers in Texas and so forth. And so now Texas and Georgia look like New York and Missouri and places like that.
That's fascinating. Kristen, you're a pollster. You've had a highly successful podcast called The Pollsters. So tell me about other areas where you see or possibly see this urban-rural divide in our economy and culture. I mean, I know that The Atlantic's Derek Thompson wrote about this density and diplomas divide. This may be also a culture war thing. I mean, do we see evidence of the urban-rural divide in other polls and other topics?
Sure. So take, for instance, we'll go back to my example of Orange versus Osceola County. I mean, Orange County is this county that has a higher than average median income. It has a higher proportion of people with bachelor's degrees than the average for the state of Florida. Where Osceola, it's much lower. It's only 20% of people, adults in Osceola County, have a bachelor's degree. The median income is much lower than it is in Orange. That part of the divide is, you do have serious socioeconomic divides. And I think it plays a role then in how people think about, let's take a policy issue like school choice, for instance. The challenges facing a rural family when it comes to having options for their children to go to school, it may be that the quality of the local school is not great, but the other options are too far away to be realistically somewhere where they could get transportation to go. Where in a city, that's not necessarily as much the problem. It may be a problem for some families, but if things are more tightly packed, there may be other issues at play. And so you can see an issue like school choice, which I think is one the conservatives can talk about even more, and to great effect to speak to voters who in cities who are very frustrated with, given that particularly at cities where teacher unions have such strong influence. We're seeing teacher unions sort of at the forefront of keeping schools closed in many of these big cities now, giving parents in cities the option to be able to send their child to another school and take that funding with them. There are just maybe different ways to talk about these issues between the cities and more rural areas.
And Jonathan, feel free to weigh in too. I mean, do you see other ways in which the urban-rural divide that you studied begins to appear in other parts of the American experience?
Well, it's just that the parties themselves have become so, I view the Democratic Party as essentially just a kind of a combination of urban interests, and the Republican Party as a kind of a collection of ex-urban and rural interests. But I guess the thing that strikes me is just how internally heterogeneous those groups are, and how this is having a two-party system that is so caught up in a geographic divide often makes us feel a lot more divided than we might actually be. There is a lot of heterogeneity within both of the parties. But both of the parties, we've developed this system in which the way for a party to conduct its messaging is to just try to convince voters that the other party is really far away from them ideologically, and so they try to kind of focus on the issues that on which people see the out party as furthest, and so we end up with these really skewed perspectives of what the other side. There's some fun polling on this, where the Democrats are asked to answer questions what they think Republicans are like, and vice versa. And it's kind of comical. The percentage of the other party that people believe as having certain characteristics that are just way off base. So I think there's something about the combination of a two-party system and the incentives of the parties and the way they craft their messages that really creates division that need not be there, and that's not there really in multi-party systems. For instance, in Europe, the way that the two-party system collides with geography, I think, makes us especially polarized and makes things especially unpleasant in our politics.
And I'm fascinated too with Dave Wasserman's finding on the differences between Whole Foods voters and Cracker Barrel voters, that how even companies and marketers are separating out into kind of democratic urban areas and focusing on them and what they want. And so are the Republican brands, so to speak. So what are some of the implications of this urban-rural divide? One of them, certainly with 2020, would be redistricting. There's surely some implications from that. Kristen, Jonathan, either one of you can jump in. What are some of the implications that we see going forward?
Sure. Well, I would go back to your comment about the Whole Foods versus Cracker Barrel, because there's a bit of a what came first, the chicken or the egg situation going on here. On the one hand, you could argue, does the presence, we don't know if it's that the presence of a Whole Foods suggests a type of voter in that area who might lean more progressive, or vice versa. Are the people in that area already sort of more progressive, and the market exists for people who are wanting this more organic produce experience, and so the market comes to meet them. And we've seen the expansion of all sorts of brands sort of adopting a more sort of environmentally conscious, organic, crunchy, whatever you want to call it, sort of mentality and approach, and that's not just because they're trying to cater to consumers in the cities. This is part of that bleed out into the suburbs, where suddenly the sort of thing that you might have only really been finding in more, upscale neighborhoods of big cities are now making their way out into the suburbs and beyond. And so in some ways that line is beginning to be blurred, and it's why the fact that suburbs are voting so much more like the cities they surround is good political news for Democrats, even though they have been unable to fully capitalize on it because Republicans have still been able to draw so many votes from so many rural areas, and the fact that Democrats may be renting rather than owning the suburbs in this case, that those voters may well swing back to the GOP after a cycle or two. So I did just want to jump in on that Whole Foods point and say, yes, it is true that Dave Wasserman pointed out many years ago, the types of communities that have Whole Foods tend to be ones that have people who are that more kind of upscale suburbanite that Democrats have had their eye on trying to win for many years. And Republicans tend to do quite well in places where there are Cracker Barrels. But you've also got a lot of places where there's suddenly going to be new lines drawn in redistricting. They have Republicans having to really fight it out in Whole Foods territory again to try to rebuild their majority. That's what I expect to see in the 2022 election.
And Jonathan, you've talked about how Republicans are more efficiently allocated electorally. That surely has implications for redistricting.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the big questions in this election. I mean, I thought so. Like the question whether the Republicans are renting or whether the Democrats are renting or owning suburbs, and I think that their rental is probably I think that's the answer from this election. I mean, after the 2018 election, there were a lot of questions about what's happening in the suburbs, and it seems that I think we shouldn't talk in just simple terms about the suburbs. I think there's really a big difference between the suburbs in big knowledge economy cities like Boston and some of the cities in the Midwest. But there's something that these places are really where the election, where the makeup of the House of Representatives and of the state legislatures are decided. And one of the interesting things that emerged in this election is that the Democrats just didn't make nearly as many gains in those places as they expected to. And so redistricting in some of these crucial states will still be in the hands of Republicans. And so if you put together the bad geography for the Democrats, so that's one of the most important implication to me, is that this problem the Democrats have where so much of their support is concentrated in cities, and then that shapes the perception of the party brand, and that makes it harder for them to win in suburbs. So that when it comes to forming a majority in a legislature, the Republicans don't need to win majorities of votes. They can win 46%, and that's might be enough in some situations. That's an important implication. But then, of course, the other implication is that they maintain control of redistricting, and it's possible then to win with even smaller minorities in some places. So the combination of geography and gerrymandering really shapes the party's incentive. So there's really not much incentive to try to change your strategy if it's working fine the way it is. So geography is very important in the U.S. to who wins, and where the lines are drawn, of course, is also very important. And the maintenance and the even strengthening of the urban-rural divide is very important for understanding how all that works. But the difference between what's happening in presidential and in House races is something that really needs to be properly understood, because all these gains in the suburbs and presidential races, that helps in a couple of important states. But if people are maintaining if it's really just a kind of a rejection of a president who people view as having been not especially competent or view as corrupt, but it isn't really a rejection of the ideological stances of the party, then that's a very different kind of story than the one people had in mind.
That's very interesting, and that does bring up an audience question. Please, everybody who's watching, submit a question. I'll wrap them into the discussion. But someone from the audience was asking, do we have a sense of what might explain or best explain that slight uptick in Republican performance in city cores? Is it some response to long-term Democratic misgovernance, Trump's celebrity appeal, stimulus checks? What might explain what was going on there?
It could be all of the above. My column that just came out today at the Washington Examiner, I also try to consider Two other factors, the big things that happened in 2020. We had unrest in major cities following the death of George Floyd, where take a city like Minneapolis, there was a lot of push to reform policing. Much of that push is perhaps well-intentioned and wants to go in the right direction. But then you wind up with the city council voting to defund the police and to take, $1 million and some in funding and take it elsewhere out of the police department. And now you just this week had reports that carjackings are up 500% in Minneapolis. So there are real consequences to many of the shifts that we're seeing in many of these cities, and whether it's related to the economic downturn or a change in the posture of policing in these cities. If folks don't feel safe, they're going to try to vote for folks that will make them feel safe. They may be more inclined to want to vote for someone who talks a lot about law and order. The second would be the pandemic, and many cities are going to be facing huge fiscal crises as a result of the loss of a lot of tax base from a lack of commerce, a lack of tourism, et cetera. I mean, many of these cities they're going to have their fiscal crises dramatically exacerbated. What we found in our research that I conducted for Manhattan Institute was that at least in New York City, when it comes to dealing with fiscal crises, people are more inclined to want to see services cut rather than having taxes go up to bring about that balance, which would suggest perhaps an appetite for more right-of-center leadership. And you also, frankly, in many of these cities, particularly ones that Democrats are running, you have really intense lockdowns that have been put in place to address the COVID-19 pandemic. But you are also seeing, the mayor of San Francisco going to dinner at the French Laundry, the mayor of Austin having gone down to Cabo for Thanksgiving while telling everybody in his city, please sit tight for Thanksgiving. There just may be an exhaustion with the current leadership, a sense of, I don't feel like I'm being protected and I don't feel like leaders are looking out for my best interests, in which case you could have an environment where decades-long patterns of people's voting behavior, if they begin going, I'm frustrated enough with the status quo and I want something new, it offers opportunity for new folks to enter that space with a different vision and potentially change what elections look like in the future.
That does raise another question from the audience. This is from Richard, is the urban-rural divide simply a function of migration from cities to neighboring suburban areas, or is it something more complicated? And I do want to add another angle here. Depending on how it intersects with migration, what do we make of any COVID-19 era migration? Is that following lines of partisan sorting or not?
If I could jump in, I think.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, just the first, I'll try to answer that, but also just on the previous issue. I don't think we should get too excited about the fact that urban core areas went from 90.05 to 90, or 90 to 89.5, which is kind of what happened. I think it's just kind of a function of turnout. There's definitely a there. It's not random. There's a little bit of a downturn, but to interpret it as like a rejection of something or other. It's just, I think it's too small. And who knows whether it's lasting. It's one of these things that could be very temporary. On the question of migration, I think that's something that everybody'd like to understand. It is, I think the urban-rural divide initially. I think that migration is a big part of where it came from, as people moved from rural areas and moved to cities and took jobs working in factories and got mobilized by labor unions. That's kind of the origin of where the urban-rural divide came from. And certainly, people, someone from rural Nebraska who wants to move to the big city and, go to college and then starts working in the knowledge economy or something, that type of migration also certainly matters. But then there's been this kind of overemphasis, I think, though, on the migration story as a cause for the urban-rural divide. If we look at what's happening right now in migration patterns, it's actually kind of the opposite to the story about the big sort. It's not the case that people are moving to places that are more partisan, more dominant of one party than the place they came from. It all depends on the unit of geography you look at, but much of the migration is among college-educated young people, and much of it is to places where the housing is more affordable than where I live. They're not moving here. There are a few people who can afford it, maybe.
Here is in Northern California, to be clear for the audience.
All these places like Arizona and suburban Atlanta. These are the places where young college-educated people who are overwhelmingly Democratic in their voting behavior they're moving, and they're moving places that are becoming more heterogeneous. So the average young person is actually living in a place that's where they're more likely to run into people from the opposite party in their neighborhood. So in that way, it's kind of if you like the idea of integration, it's things are moving in a good direction.
And I was just going to add to that, I did some research this summer for the Walton Family Foundation where we were studying a lot of things about millennials and Generation Z, but among them, what types of communities do millennials and Generation Zers want to live in? And what we found sort of runs counter to this notion that every young American wants to go, found the next tech startup and move to Silicon Valley or move to, a big city. That in fact, we found that for the most part, if you are a young person and you live in the suburbs, you're kind of happy with living in the suburbs. If you're a young person who lives in a rural area, you're probably happy with living in a rural area. And also that there's less interest, I think, in bouncing around and moving constantly than one might, expect from the popular narrative. It's not to say that there's not mobility or that there aren't people out there that don't want to move either to a more rural or more urban area, but that there's a little more satisfaction with the level of density where they live among young people, even as we do see general trends toward young people preferring walkable communities, et cetera, the types of things you would tend to find in denser areas. It does not mean that young people are all moving to big cities, especially given, as Jonathan mentioned, the very high housing costs and costs of living there. If they can find good job opportunities elsewhere that'll still allow them to live in a walkable community, but maybe not pay an exorbitant amount in rent, that's the types of places that they're wanting to live.
If I could add something to that, another source of another type of migration that we don't talk about enough is that there is an out migration from the urban core of middle class minorities. And this is really an important demographic trend. In my hometown of St. Louis, there's been significant out migration from the urban core to suburban areas, and we see similar things happening in Georgia and Texas. Houston is becoming a real, it's becoming a much more racially kind of diverse, heterogeneous, sprawling kind of region, and that has much to do with Black suburbanization, and that's something that's happening in lots of places. And so that's also creating a more diverse, a politically diverse suburban environment.
This does raise a question that Elliot just asked from the audience. Does any of that represent then an opportunity for some sort of cross-partisan urban-rural coalition, or are the divides still too stark as it is? Jonathan or Kristen, feel free to weigh in. Kristen, I'll turn to you.
Oh.
Our silence probably should tell you something.
No, I was figuring it was a follow-up to what you had just said, so I was going to defer to you on that one. Yeah, I think there are opportunities insofar as, if there are, middle-class folks that are leaving cities and moving to suburbs that might have a sort of difference of what they're looking for, and that has driven part of why they've moved, that they feel like what was happening in the city was for some reason or another, they didn't want any part of it. Maybe they didn't like the schools, maybe the housing was too expensive, they were worried about crime, whatever it was. As they move to the suburbs, again, this is an area where Democrats are really making a focus. Does that mean there will be a political evolution, or is this exactly part of the group that Republicans should be expanding their message to, especially given, again, not huge gains on overall, but small gains, little bits of hope for the folks on the right, to begin to sort of seize upon those and continue that conversation that's obviously already begun?
Yeah, I think the answer is to these questions really change as the geographic scale that we're talking about alters. So I think it's fascinating to look at the history of gubernatorial elections. If you were just looking at gubernatorial data, you'd think that Vermont was a basically Republican state. They've had Republican governors, I think, more than they've had Democratic governors over the last 30 years. And we look at Massachusetts and look at Maryland. And so like in gubernatorial elections, anything can happen. A Democrat can win Kansas. So and then as we go down the scale into cities, I think there are definitely places where the right type of Republican candidate can be successful. And of course, rural places are far more heterogeneous and diverse than we give them credit for. And so I think that when we get caught up in a national presidential election, that's kind of the worst of it. But as we start going down and we start focusing more on policy, I think both parties have the opportunity to craft locally specific messages that allow them to compete in territory that's unfamiliar.
Yeah, I think it's completely about the issue set that's at hand. I mean, I think the reason why you can have someone like Charlie Baker win statewide in Massachusetts is that most of what that campaign is about, most of what his message is about sort of competent management of the state of Massachusetts rather than many of the hot button issues that's kind of defined the Republican brand writ large nationwide, or more conservative positions on more hot button issues. That's really the only way that you can wind up with a situation where you have Republicans winning the governorship in deep blue territory, places like Vermont, et cetera. And similarly, it's what allows somebody like a Democrat to win the gubernatorial race in a state where otherwise it's pretty challenging to imagine a Democrat winning in the nearer term. But the issue set that's front and center is hugely defining in whether people are really thinking about an election through a partisan and ideological lens, or whether they're thinking about it in terms of who's going to make sure my trash gets picked up. And I think ultimately elections that are at the state and certainly at the local level are much more likely to be decided on those sorts of basic competence management issues rather than the stuff that really gets people emotionally driven at a more kind of high level perspective.
And Kristen, surely this is a message to those running for office or for parties to focus on those state and local issues. It seems like all the time I'm seeing mayors talking about national issues and trying to get some play on national television. But it does seem like local and state issues, and even pocketbook issues too at the state and local level, really do make a difference. One of the questions from our audience is on Florida with education and really pressing that as a point for voters there. I know you're from Florida. It seems like any way that we can push back against that increasing nationalization maybe would be good for those running for office, maybe for the country as a whole.
Well, and you're right. There was some data to suggest that the reason why Ron DeSantis was able to be a candidate that sort of bucked the blue wave of the 2018 midterms was his focus on an issue like school choice, and in particular, his ability to do better than expected with African-American voters in Florida as a result. So there's some evidence for that certainly being the case. I mean, whether you want to focus on the national issues or the local issues may also depend on whether you are part of the prevailing partisan sentiment in your area. You can easily see why, I don't know, a Democratic mayor from South Bend, Indiana might want to talk a lot about national issues. Whereas, if you are the Republican mayor of San Diego, California, with the way that California has shifted even bluer and bluer and bluer, although Republicans did have some success further down ballot. If you're the Republican mayor of San Diego, maybe talking a lot about Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation is not the way for you to go. So it may depend just on what kind of the environment is in your area, to what extent it benefits you to weigh in on these more nationalized issues.
And I do want to move on quickly to where we go from here. But one other quick question. I'm from Texas originally, and I have friends of mine who talk all about migration into Texas and how it's changing Texas. And you see arguments going both ways. You see, folks saying, well, individuals are moving from the coast and they're going to turn Texas blue. But I also see people, fleeing, say, high housing costs on the coasts. People who are disenfranchised Republican voters moving into a place like Texas and going to Austin and saying, well, we want to change things. Maybe Jonathan, this is for you. How does migration change, let's say, from the coast? How do they change the states that are receiving these coastal migrants, if at all?
Well, there are two ways to think about it. I mean, everybody focuses for good reason on the Electoral College, and we think about states as a whole, and we wonder when certain states that are trending in a certain direction might flip. And I mean, that's an important question when we look at Georgia and Arizona. But I think there's another interesting question, is just how are people arranged within those states? And there's a lot of also kind of internal migration within Texas. I was talking about the changes in Houston. I think that stuff also, so in migration also shapes the internal There's less concentration of Democrats in the urban core if we have a lot of suburban, young, educated people moving, escaping California, say moving to suburban Austin or suburban Phoenix, and making those suburban environments, pushing them in the direction of the Democratic Party. Just to look at some, I've collected, put together domestic migration data from the Census Department and merged that together just quickly with the results, the county level results as they've been coming in. And the correlation between domestic in-migration and change in Democratic vote share is very high. So I think there is something to this story. Places that are gaining population are becoming more Democratic. That's just very clear in the data. Places that are losing population are becoming more Republican at the county level, and that's true within states. And of course, there are lots of interesting exceptions to that. So the interesting things that we were talking about earlier that are happening with the Latino vote in Florida and Texas pushed in the opposite direction, and so they kind of blurred a little bit of this. So I mean, this thing does seem to be happening, but the numbers are not, they're just not so huge that Texas, just with a couple of years of in-migration to suburban Austin is going to flip. That seemed, and there's also many, as you described, many other things happening pushing in the opposite direction. So the net effect is kind of small. But there are interesting changes, I think, in the distribution of folks within states. And so if we care about Congress or state legislatures, I think those are interesting things to keep an eye on, not just the kind of, when will Texas, if ever, flip.
That's fascinating. Jonathan, I do want to stick with you. Where do we go from here then? What is the urban-rural divide here to stay? Stare into your crystal ball. What are you seeing?
I have a hard time. I guess I try to ask myself, well, what turn of events do I think would unravel this thing? And and I think about, I can think about counterfactuals like, what if the Democrats had nominated 4 years ago had nominated Bernie Sanders, and the Republicans had nominated a more traditional candidate? You could imagine that sort of like Sanders kind of capturing a lot of rural the same kind of voters that ended up joining and becoming very strong Trump supporters. You can imagine a world in which they would have hitched their wagon to someone like Sanders, and we would have seen a more left version of populism. I mean, that didn't come to pass, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. So that's one way the Democrats could have become more competitive in rural places. When we look at the long scope of history, of course, realignments happened. The Southern realignment happened. The kind of New Deal realignment I was talking about earlier, that happened, and it happened somewhat quickly. But for the most part, these things take time, and I don't see, during my lifetime, I don't see this just going away. I don't see what turn of events would produce that. Certainly, we could see some kind of slow unraveling, but it seems to me likely that it's here for a while at least.
Kristen, I wonder what your take is. Where does this urban-rural divide go from here, in your viewpoint?
So I have a similar take, that it doesn't strike me that we are likely to see the urban-rural divide go away anytime soon. I think especially so long as the parties themselves remain fairly oriented around, the Republican Party being it was not always the case that the Republican Party was as uniformly conservative and the Democratic Party was as uniformly progressive, as ideologically polarized as they are. The liberal Republican or the conservative Democrat is something of a dying breed in our politics and has been for a while. I think as long as that's the case, and as long as the Republican Party remains the party that is more focused on, sort of conservative cultural norms, those sorts of things, whether we're talking about guns, et cetera, you can easily see how Republicans would hold much greater sway. It's sort of an emotional level. Our party is the party that gets you level in rural areas, even if the Republican Party post-Trump begins moving, away from economic populism and moving back towards sort of Trumpian, more free market type posture. But I think as long as you've got those sort of cultural and emotional issues that are important in rural areas that align with where Republicans are at in terms of their conservative posture, just broadly, that will stay fairly firmly cemented unless Democrats are able to really credibly make an economically populist argument that does speak to folks in rural areas without also sort of turning them off with very progressive sort of cultural positions. And I think you somewhat see the inverse in the cities. I mean, cities, I think, are fascinating because on the one hand, you often have the greatest level of social inequality, where you have folks that are extraordinarily wealthy and then folks that are extraordinarily poor, all within very close quarters. And so an economic populist message might make a great deal of sense to somebody who is living sort of on the margins, living at the poverty level in the city, and is looking for someone to say, hey, I need some help. But at the same time, it's those sort of wealthier folks who may not be economic populists, but they may be quite culturally very progressive. And that sort of creates this divide between how can the left hang on to the two pieces of those puzzle within cities, because the folks that just are trying to figure out how to put food on the table, they may not be interested in some of the more esoteric, cultural fights that the progressives are fighting. They may just want someone who can answer the question of how can I feed my family? And if conservatives can enter and say, look, we're not going to push this cultural progressivism on you, and won't even talk about the cultural conservative stuff either, but we do want to talk about economic prosperity and opportunity, that can create, I think, a wedge there that would be interesting to see if folks on the right can move forward with.
Yeah, if I could just add a little comparative perspective, if you look at precinct level voting patterns in metro areas of Europe, things look very different. Like the urban core of Sweden votes for conservative parties, and these are not culturally conservative parties. The point I'm making is that when you have a multi-party system, it turns out that voters have diverse preferences on lots of different issues, and that the Silicon Valley kind of Democrat is anti-regulation and doesn't really like taxes very much, but they feel very strongly about some social issues. And so in a multi-party democracy, there would be a liberal party, which would have a kind of a center-left platform on what we call center-left. I don't even know if that's the right terms on social issues, but they would have a center-right platform on economic issues. And that's who the kind of educated urban voter in much of Europe votes for. We have no such party in the United States. We have these two bundles, and we imagine ourselves to be so coalesced into these bundles. But the point I was making earlier, I think there's just a lot more heterogeneity within those bundles. And if we had a more diverse party system, we would see some interesting things emerge. We're kind of forced into these two options, and that creates a lot of the polarization that we perceive and that we feel.
Jonathan, do you see? Go ahead.
The one thing I want to add on that, though, is I oftentimes, one of my favorite ways to freak people out when I'm giving a talk to, say, like a bunch of business executives or what have you, is to ask them how many people in this room would consider themselves fiscally conservative but socially progressive, and tons of hands go up, because that's, for folks that are coming from cities or from wealthier backgrounds and are managers or C-suite executives at big companies, that tends to be a pretty common political profile. And then I have to break the news to them that's it, like that there are very few actual Americans who hold that sort of issue profile. As someone who sort of leans that way myself personally, it breaks my heart every time I have to shadow people's perceptions. But there is a far greater constituency out there in the country for a more socially conservative, economically progressive, or more populist sort of policy agenda. And I think sometimes folks who sort of live in cities and only interact with people like them can kind of forget that there is really an appetite for that out there.
Yeah, I think there are people in both of those off diagonals, and we are left to kind of believe otherwise by the media environment and the strategies of the parties in a two-party system. But absolutely, I think I think that's part of what Trump tapped into, is exactly that sort of set of voters who are maybe in that box, in the two-dimensional space that we're talking about.
And Jonathan, do you see any electoral reforms on the horizon that would shift that dynamic? Maybe either introduce more party competition, or at least disentangle the partisan sorting within our two-party system?
Well, as you could probably tell from some of the things I was saying, I like the idea of, I think there are a lot of nice things about a multi-party system, but I certainly don't, in my crystal ball, I do not see one emerging in the United States, and I don't see a reform coalition that would produce that anytime soon. I mean, I think it is, again, to think about the state and local level, and election reformers in the U.S. have been on this for a long time. If we want to think about reform and experiments, why not? Like let's. Why not take a West Coast state that has a referendum process and kind of get around the legislative elites, who of course have no interest in any kind of reform? It would take something like a referendum, try out proportional representation in Oregon, and just see what happens. I don't think it would be the worst thing in the world. But do I see this happening in a lot of places anytime soon? Not really. The other big question is, well, what if one of the parties splits apart, and the two parties compete with each other to see which one seems to be most on the verge of splitting apart? There was a time when the cleavage between the Tea Partiers and the traditional Republicans seemed really intense. I think in general, for reasons having to do with geography, the Democratic Party has a stronger kind of internal cleavage between its urban core and its kind of the Slotkin and sort of Connor Lamb and that type of moderate. But you can imagine, well, is there a world in which one of these parties splits up, and we end up with something like the divide between the NDP and the Liberals, say, in Canada? But again, I don't see that happening either, because you can run with a D next to your name and say almost anything. You can say, I'm running as a Democrat, and my plan is to get to Washington and get rid of Nancy Pelosi. Like, that's my platform. In a presidential system, you can do that. In a parliamentary system, you can't. And so that's why you end up with more fragmentation in the party system, say in Canada. Whereas here we can have Democrats who are who are socialists, and we can have Democrats who completely disavow socialism, and they can get away with it because there's no party discipline.
Right. Do you make anything of these movements for ranked choice voting in places like Maine or in other states? Or is that still, nationwide, a long ways off?
I think ranked choice voting is like sort of a light version of reform that sort of doesn't do violence to the existing system of single member districts. And so for that reason, people might be more likely, I think people are more likely to see the logic of it. And they kind of like the idea, well, if I like the Greens, or if I like the Libertarians, and I can rank them first and not necessarily throw away my vote, that, my second choice vote for the Republican candidate, if I'm a Libertarian, say, it's not going to throw the election to the other side. I think that does help people who like the idea of a multi-party system, and I don't see what they have to lose by supporting that type of reform. I see no downside to it, and so yeah, I could see more people getting behind ranked choice voting in state and local elections.
Well, and Kristen, do you see? Jonathan represented a couple minutes ago he gave this example of counterfactual with Bernie Sanders. Is there a Republican counterfactual where a Republican candidate could have crossed that urban-rural divide, or is that really a message to governors, kind of also along the lines of what Jonathan was saying, that really down ballot you see the most interesting movement and potentially the most interesting opportunities for movement across this divide?
Yeah, I think it's much more about the further down ballot races, in part because of the issue set that's involved there, but also the fact that once you've reached the presidential level, you have a brand image that's pretty well baked into people's minds. And in fact, if you are somebody's presidential nominee, your brand kind of becomes fused with the brand of the national party, in ways that are tough for either to escape. Where further down the ballot, you just have more flexibility to kind of be an individual on your own. And frankly, in a way that's, I think, unique to the American system, or at least systems that have this sort of first past the post voting. I mean, if you go to, I absolutely love New Zealand, for instance. New Zealand has a parliamentary system, and there you're going to see very little dissension of individual members from the main party line. In most parliamentary systems, there's very, if you're in a party, you are voting with your party on things. Where here in the U.S., leaders of parties have to do much more work to kind of herd their cats and what have you, because that sort of individualism and individual spirit can cause more headaches for party leaders. I just think you kind of get this really interesting, strange variety of who can emerge and where they can emerge here in the US as a result of our system. And I think it means that those who are further down the ballot have a little more leeway and flexibility to be experimental in their pursuits.
Well, I think this has been a fascinating discussion. Clearly, the urban-rural divide is here to stay, but nothing is set in stone. There can be cracks even in that picture, as we saw in 2020. Thank you both for your perspective, and thank you to our audience for watching. Please consider subscribing to our newsletters or contributing to our mission. It's what enables conversations just like this. Kristen, Jonathan, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.